Hi, Misha here, and we've looked at some Glocks recently, and of course we had the big GoldenEye 007 video, which if you haven't seen, definitely go check that out. But let's slow things down. And I thought it's time to talk about an American classic, the shotgun again. The thing is, I don't own all that many. Quite recently, we revisited my good old Winchester here in a video, looking at the history of the Model 12 mostly, but also a bit of the 97. And I've talked your ears off already on the Benelli M4, the 1014. And you've seen the AK shotguns here more than a couple of times. But one we haven't really delved terribly deep into recently, the Ithaca Model 37 trench gun, and this is the replica that came out a few years back. And I have some table talk footage that frankly I recorded a while back and thought was lost, but luckily it was recovered on a hard drive, so let's do a little deep dive into it. Why not? Hope everyone had a good Labor Day. And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please do check out the Patreon page. And sorry, the dehumidifier just kicked on. So with that, let's jump into it. Specs for the Ithaca M37 so-called trench gun. We have a 20-inch cylinder bore barrel with a 3-inch Magnum or 2 3/4 chamber. Of course, the originals were 2 3/4 only. We have a standard bayonet lug heat shield assembly with the brass bead sight affixed on top. We have the standard large front sling swivel. We have, of course, an unadorned corncob pump made of walnut, just kind of oil. It is a single action bar. We have some quite authentic markings, although they're not going to be mistaken for originals, frankly, but it's there. And we don't have the game scene on the side. We do have a metal trigger guard and housing with original style controls. Of course, we have a rear sling swivel. We have the unadorned walnut buttstock to match the pump, complete with the correct style black synthetic butt plate. Flipping it over, we have the standard 4+1 tube, standard takedown that does require tools, bottom ejection, and while these did not come with a bayonet, they did come, at least mine, with a sling. So, something. Again, mostly made by Ithaca, although they are branded under Inland. And I do believe Inland does make the heat shield bayonet lug assembly. They may make other components as well. So here I am in front of the camera. One thing that's always attracted me to the 37 civilian or military, and a lot of other people, how nice this slide action is. Of course, it locks when you have this. Your release is here. That is just a smooth system. And at least this one, very nice trigger. Who doesn't like the old corncob style? And it is a very lightweight, very well balanced gun. Only kind of ding, I'd say, the hard butt plate. Yeah, it's a shotgun. You know how that goes. Of course, the commercial ones and even the newer police ones, they actually have a true recoil pad. But since this was designed to be a replica, of a very specific 60s era gun. I'm actually very pleased they used the correct butt plate here. Just, yeah, hard old plastic or rubber, whatever you want to call it. The Ithaca shotgun story goes all the way back to the beginning of World War I, when the U.S. was still neutral. And while the design this is based on is often attributed to John Moses Browning, which is true, it was actually a joint project with another very important arms creator, designer, inventor, John Pedersen, who's not as well known today. Kind of a shame. The two came up with a new shotgun design that was bottom feeding and ejecting, and they sold it to the Remington Company, and they put it in production as the Model 17. It was lightweight, easy to manage, but it was only in 20 gauge. And Remington would discontinue the Model 17 around 1933, replacing it with their improved Model 31, which itself would be eventually replaced 2 decades later by the Model 870. You may have heard of it. Well, in steps the Ithaca Company. The designers there took a look at the Model 17 and Browning and Pedersen's original creation and thought they could do one better. So they strengthened the design while at the same time making it a little bit lighter weight, reducing the number of parts, and just overall refining it. And they were prepared to introduce this to the market in the early 30s, 1932, 1933. But just as they were standing to wrap up, they realized that there were still patents that were valid for the Remington Model 17. Even though it was going out of production, Remington still had the patents on it. So they basically had to shelve it. But it was the Great Depression, so yeah. Eventually, of course, they would release their updated version as the Model 37, not surprisingly, in 1937, once the patents had expired. And this was in 12 gauge. The following years would see it introduced in 16 and 20 gauge as well. And this was designed for the sporting market, of course, the hunting market. And its big attraction, it was called the Featherweight. It was a very lightweight shotgun for the day and time, around 6 pounds, give or take. And with a common barrel length of around 28 to 30 inches, depending on which version you bought. Typically with a very nice checkered polished wood in a very nice blued finish. And it had a game scene on the other side of the receiver. So, that was the sporting gun. But of course, World War II was on the horizon, and any and every arms manufacturer would put their talents towards that. Beginning in 1940, the Ordnance Department started looking at trying to make something like a standard, or at least an acceptable series of pump shotguns. And in August of 1941, they released a list of half a dozen pumps that were approved, all of course in 12 gauge, for riot, training, and frankly game use, hunting use if possible. And these would of course include the Winchester Model 97 and Model 12, the Remington Model 31, and a couple of models from Savage, the 530 and 620, very similar, and the, at the time, quite very new Ithaca Model 37. And now, they'd already actually purchased a few of the long-barreled 37s by this point, late summer of 41, for training, trap shooting, and frankly just sports shooting at military bases. And of course, America's still not in the war. However, that November, Winchester would get their first contract for riot guns, and riot guns with handguard and bayonet lug attachment, aka trench shotguns, trench guns. And that kind of put Ithaca on notice that they should maybe create a trench gun variant of their M37 too. And for them, it was kind of a good thing that they did. Around March of 1942, Ithaca would obtain a contract for just such a gun, essentially an M37 trench gun. And they would order 1,420, and the majority were delivered in June and July of that year. And there would be 2 more, for some reason, sent over in September. So 1,422 so-called trench guns produced in World War II by Ithaca. And these would have the common features, like this one here. Heat shield, 20-inch cylinder bore barrel with bead sight, standard 1917 compatible bayonet lug, sling swivel on the front, sling swivel on the back, typical hard rubber or plastic butt plate. Now, the World War II guns would not have the game scene on the side, at least the trench guns, but they would be in a blued finish, not phosphate, not Parkerized. And while some would have the checkered, kind of the finer wood because it was left over, many would just have simple oiled walnut. And these would have the inspector stamp of RLB for Roy L. Bullen, who was the colonel in charge of inspection in the Rochester district of New York, where Ithaca was at. And they would have U.S. property. Interestingly, the stock would not be stamped. It would actually be the receiver this time. By the way, these would be 4+1 tube. Otherwise, pretty standard features. Now, other guns were purchased from Ithaca as well. They would pick up about 4,500 of the long barrel models, mostly between the summer of 1941 and early fall of 1942, and a small number of riot guns. Now, these would be essentially the same gun, but without the heat shield and bayonet lug. Some sources claim the riot guns had 18-inch barrels, others say 20. Maybe it was both. And it's uncertain if the riot guns would have the rear sling swivel or not. Probably not. And these guns could have the game scene still on the side of the receiver because they were more just, standard. For World War II, that was it for Ithaca military production. So you're looking at, not much over 6,000, maybe 7,000 tops, including the riot guns and the long barrels and the trench guns. It wasn't that the guns were bad. It was that Ithaca, by 1942, had the contract to produce pistols like this, of course. The Ithaca Model 1911A1. The Ordnance Department assessed things and decided that was a better use of their resources. They actually did a pretty good job of making these. That would leave Winchester to mostly fulfill the duties of building shotguns during World War II, especially trench guns. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about these pistols, I've done a full video on them in the past. I just thought I would bring it out since it is World War II Ithaca. Late in the war, they would also get involved in the, at the time, new M3 45 caliber grease gun, submachine gun. And so that's kind of where we're at. Very few trench guns from World War II, and they would be blued. More of the long barrels, and pretty much unknown number of the short-barreled riot guns. We do know, based on serial numbers, that the Ithaca trench guns were between 57,000 and 61,000, give or take, serial range. So if someone's trying to sell you an original World War II Ithaca, be highly skeptical because very few were made. They were used in the Pacific, so some were lost there, and some would continue to be issued throughout the Korean War, even though no new ones were needed. While most were just guard duty guns, some were used on point, especially on jungle islands in the Pacific, so not that many survived the war, and not that many survived Korea, which kind of explains why there was a need by the 1960s. The U.S. actually purchased quite a large number of trench guns, riot guns, sporting guns during World War II. However, after the war, many were sold off to police departments or foreign allies, or even as surplus to the civilian market. So for Korea, they didn't have so many, and the ones that were hanging out were used by the Marines, namely. So fast forward to really even before the Vietnam War is going, what we have are worn out, we need more. Thus, we get the first contract with Ithaca in 1962. Why Ithaca? Well, the Savages are out of production. The Remington Model 31 is out of production. Winchester is no longer making the Model 97. And while the Model 12 is technically still in production, Winchester is wrapping things up. Its last official year would be 63, with some small batches made through 66, 67. On top of that, it's hard to get parts for these World War II vintage guns, and they're wearing out, as I said. In the beginning, we don't actually need Ithacas for the USA. We need them for South Vietnam, Saigon, allies. So a contract for roughly 22,000 is placed with Ithaca in the end of 1962, and deliveries are made to South Vietnam between the middle of November and the very end of January, running into 1963. These guns are in the 50,000 to 71, essentially 72,000, 71999 range, according to Ithaca factory records. And they're not trench guns. They are riot guns. They have a military-style finish, and they have sling swivels, and they have a short barrel. But otherwise, they're a standard shotgun, 12-gauge, 4+1. They do ship with a web sling cleaning kit. That's about it. Now, we can talk about, in another video, the Hull Stevens Model 77E, because it's a very interesting story, but we're focusing on Ithaca today. So just know that that played a major role, and is one reason that Ithaca did not get another contract with South Vietnam at this juncture. However, in 1963, would get its first U.S. contract. And this is where the S prefix guns come in. They ranged from S1000 up to S23,000. And you would think, oh, these are the trench guns now, right? Nope. These are riot guns, very, very much like the Vietnamese contract ones, except they don't even have the sling swivels. So essentially, they're just short-barreled Ithaca 37s. And these are intended for guards and for guys going on point. Keep in mind, when these are ordered, we're not really in Vietnam yet, aside from advisors. So, kind of gives you an idea of what they're thinking. And these would start to see a phosphate finish instead of a blue because of the environs that South Vietnam would end up being, although some will be blued. Moving forward, now we actually get into Vietnam. May of 1966, the U.S. Navy orders roughly 3,000 Ithaca Model 37s to be used by the Navy SEALs, the U.S. Marines, and others. And you'd think, okay, finally we're getting the trench guns. Nope again. These are yet again riot guns. Now these usually do have a phosphate finish, and sling swivels seem to be more common, but hard to say. These will be in the 900,000 up to about 950,000 serial range, so we're no longer using that special S prefix bulk run there. And yeah, So where the heck are the trench guns? We seem to be just ordering short-barreled. Some sources say 18, most say 20. Either way, short-barreled riot guns with or without sling swivels, no heat shield, no bayonet lug, and with the standard 4+1 tube. I haven't found any accounts of the extended tubes in use. I'll also point out, because the replicas here, these are still 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge, not 3-inch Magnum. Well, there's only really 2 orders of trench guns that are accounted for in the Vietnam period. One came in very late 1963 from the U.S. Air Force, who picked up just over 200 from Ithaca. And these would be World War II style, complete with the original bayonet lug, heat shield. Interestingly, the one on this one is a 6-hole, so kind of a World War I style, instead of the Winchester 4-hole. But they would be phosphated. That's the big difference between World War II and Vietnam. Also, the markings. I should point out that the Vietnamese contract guns did not have U.S. on them because they were not U.S. property. They were foreign aid. The S prefix guns would have U.S. property, as would the rest meant for the Navy. So that's one contract. Another somewhat larger but still quite small contract would come in 1967 for another batch of trench guns. And, the serials on these are a little uncertain. 980,000 seems to be sort of kind of the range, but at this point there aren't factory records, so it's kind of guesswork, which means there could be other small purchases, small contracts we may not know at this point in the war. One other interesting thing does involve the bayonet lug. Even though the 1917 Enfield bayonet, the long one, 16-inch blade, had been out of production for decades, these Ithaca trench guns were built to accept it. Some sources claim that the lug on the Ithaca is for the M7 bayonet, so the M16. This is not true. This is incorrect. I think they're mixing them up with the later Remington Model 870 or even later Mossbergs. But the Ithacas, no, they still did this. And I think the reason was Ithaca had designed this assembly during World War II. They didn't make many of them, and the orders in Vietnam were so small, it wasn't worth redesigning. Hey, they've got it, it works, let's stick with it. What the U.S. did not necessarily have were a ton of these bayonets. So they would reissue some originals, but they actually contracted with a couple of companies to make new production 1917 pattern bayonets in the middle of the Vietnam War, and you can ID these by their black grips. Also, some originals might be refurbished with these grips. That tells me there must have at least been a fair number of M37 trench guns, in addition to older M12s and what have you from Winchester. Otherwise, they would not have needed to actually make a couple of contract orders for new bayonets. But again, we really don't know full sure. These were actually quite useful in Vietnam, shotguns in general. Although a lot of times U.S. troops weren't issued these, they would actually obtain them from the South Vietnamese. They were, of course, useful on point. They were useful for quickly defoliating an area, blowing through brush. They were also useful on brown water craft, on boats going up rivers and stuff. You can understand why. Shooting in the bush, or sometimes detonating water mines. They were also sometimes used to detonate land mines, at least that's the story. Shotgun you can make sense of. There was, of course, the famous experiments with the so-called ducktail extension on the barrel that tried to spread the shot out. They didn't work great. And while the U.S. used probably more Stevens 77Es. It was more a matter of availability than actual preference. The Ithaca 37 actually had a good reputation for being very durable and dependable. It had a few shortcomings, but overall it was a much more trusted gun than the Stevens. However, beggars can't be choosers, and without enough shotguns to go around, plenty of US GIs were just happy to get even a Stevens. Now that was early in mid-war. By the end of the war, newer guns are coming around. From Winchester, they have their model 1200. And from Remington, now the 870 is starting to make an impact, especially within the Navy. They have their own version, the Mark 1. So Ithaca contracts don't continue past 67, 68. But of course the guns in service will carry on. Now what's interesting, Ithaca overproduced, especially these trench gun styles. Not wanting to have them go to waste, throughout the 70s, they sold off a lot of trench guns to police departments. And with civil disobedience and unrest going on, this was seen as a better, less lethal alternative, especially when armed with birdshot. So quite a few M37s were not military service, they were police. But they were the same gun, complete with phosphated finish and heat shield handguard. Just, PD marked. They would even have so many that they would sell a decent number to the civilian market in the 70s, maybe even leading into the 80s. Hard to say, but that would seem to be where several thousand went. Of course, no machine is perfect. As I've said before, I do like how you can easily load shells, your lifters out of the way. But the way this is done, you can't really load one shell manually like you could on, say, a Remington by charging it back or anything like that. It does make it a little limited the way this system works. Plus these forks, you can understand possibly why that would, do some funny things. Even sometimes when I've shot Ithacas, that can get a little jammed up in interesting ways. And when it happens, this is not an easy gun to disassemble. Not like a Mossberg, definitely not like a Remington or a Benelli. You actually have to break out the tools and really get to it and start unscrewing things and unlatching things. And that has always kind of been one of the, things I just had to recognize. It's one of my favorite shotguns, but it shows its age. A lot of shotguns developed at its time were just like that. Yeah, it's a good gun, but soldiers did find some weird issues in the field. In a lot of ways, the M37, be it the trench or the riot gun, was kind of the last of the old style pump-action shotguns in U.S. military service. It was part of the interwar generation with a design dating back to Browning and Pedersen. After this, we really do cross into post-war designs like the Remington and the Mossberg. Even the Winchester 1200 is very different from the Model 97 and Model 12. And so this was the last of an era. And it wasn't beat out by the Stevens 77E because the Stevens was a better gun. It was because the Stevens was a cheaper gun, sometimes much to its detriment. But again, I want to talk about the Stevens 77E and 69R in a different video. For today, I just felt like having this out again, because it is a good, I don't want to even say clone, even though Ithaca is in a different place. It's still made by the Ithaca company with Inland. It really does seem to be more of a reissue in the vibe, kind of like the Colt reissues. or some of the reproduction 1911s. It's authentic, but it doesn't try to be something it's not. It does have noteworthy differences from the original, but it also has a vibe and looks really cool and works really well. This isn't a Chinese clone or copy. These are entirely US made. So, just felt like chatting about her again today. And there we have it. Pretty much everything I know about this shotgun. Putting it back on the rack. I've always liked the Ithaca. They're fun. I really enjoy both shooting them and, yeah, collecting them. Maybe one day I'll stumble across an original. Not terribly likely. But Ithaca/Inland did a very respectable job with these reissues. I hate to even call them a clone because they are Ithaca branded. But yeah, little change of pace, slowing things down, talking about a Vietnam and American classic. But don't worry, my cousin has been wanting to shoot the Benelli again soon, so we'll probably do that. And I bet we'll bring out the Veprs and the Segas for too terribly long. As I said at the beginning, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help, check out the Patreon page, because, yeah, these do take a lot of time, even pretty simple ones like this video, and production cost and all that. You know how it goes, so every bit of support is greatly appreciated and greatly does help. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.